our new Agrarian Toolkit webinar series, where our topic today is putting soil health into practice. We're super excited for all of you to join us tonight. I think it'll be a really interesting 90 minutes of interesting presentations and discussion together. Just real quick for those of you who don't know about the new Agrarian program. We are an apprenticeship program on regenerative ranches in Montana, Colorado, and New Mexico. And our apprenticeships usually start in March and end in November. So our applications for the 2024 season will start this year in November. And we're in the middle of our apprentice season right now. I see we have a few apprentices joining us tonight, which is always fun to see. Yeah, if you have any other questions about us, feel free to check in with any of us at the Quivira team. And just real quick, yeah, like Taylor said, if you can, if you're able to turn your camera on, we do appreciate that. If you need to rename yourself, feel free to do so. While we're listening to people presenting, please try to keep yourself on mute. If you do have questions, which I hope that we'll get a lot of questions, feel free to just drop those in the chat. If you're kind of in the middle of somebody presenting, you're thinking of something you want to ask, you're more than welcome to drop it in the chat, and we will address questions after all three presenters have presented. And then we'll go through questions that might be in the chat or anything that you have on your mind. Feel free to speak up and ask whichever you might want to ask. So with that, I think I'm ready to turn it over to our first presenters, Nancy and Steve Oswald.
Yeah, good evening. I'm going to give you a little background of where we've been and where we hope to be going. We moved back to the ranch here in Cotopaxi in 1991 and took over the lease from Nancy's parents. At that time, there were two pastures, winter and summer, and both of them were severely overgrazed, lots of bare ground everywhere. So that's the first thing we did was stop the overgrazing. We built, we now have 35 or so permanent paddocks that we divide up in addition to, so we probably end up with over 100 paddocks during the summertime or during the grazing season. When we did this, we initially saw a huge increase in production and plant species, but after a few years that tapered off, we kind of plateaued. And I was always puzzling why, because we practice adaptive managed grazing, doing, daily moves, sometimes 2 to 3 times a day, high stock density. And I had always believed that, we can really change things with cattle. But we found out that that's not necessarily the case, which is why we're trying to learn how to farm again. In '98, we heard Dr. Christine Jones from Australia speak, and that kind of opened up our eyes to what's happening underneath the soil surface, that there's an underground herd of critters there, and they're very important. And that's led us off into our journey into soil health and stuff like mycorrhizal fungi. We've done some cover cropping, but it's, again, mixed results. I think timing is everything. Timing is critical in terms of moisture, because most of our ranch is not irrigated.
I'll say something about this slide.
Sure.
Yeah, so just if you haven't recognized this big cow pie with all the dung beetles in it, that's one thing we're really proud of is, just you know, when you can see those dung beetles like in the soil and on the grass, then you know that something's going right. So we were with an NRCS sort of study, and we had to take pictures of the cow pies, and this one was a really good example of what the dung beetles actually do. So there are a few things we're doing right. Steve might say we're still learning, and we are truly, but this is you know, just one of the things we have tried to look for when we walk around and look at the soil.
So the last thing I was going to mention was that we got a SARE grant to study applying high fungal compost extract. We've done that in conjunction with Annie Overland with CSU Extension, and again, mixed results. It's been interesting, so I'm going to turn that over to you. Take off.
Well, yeah, so we are going to talk a little bit more about our SARE grant a little bit later, but one of the other things we do is monitor. We've actually been monitoring for a long time, trying to, like, you can really see the difference in these pictures, because you really want them when you monitor. You're looking for mostly ground cover. So we do yearly monitoring, and when did we start monitoring? It's been 98. So it's and again, you know, so much of it depends on water and the year, and it's not always like just a steady climb one way or the other, but it is information. So the more information you can collect, then it's just helpful. You know, it just informs you on what kind of plans you're going to make. So this was one of our projects. We call it the Pinyon Pine project, and we well, Steve is convinced, and I agree with him, that the pinyons in them, by themselves are not a problem, but they totally suck the water out of the ground. So we did a little clearing project where we cut a little piece of pinyon, seeded, and got the cows on there, and then this is the result. So again, it's just ongoing. We're trying to see what works, and this is one of the things that is where you can see the grass come back through livestock and seeding and just different management. And this is a pinyon project. So so I love this quote because it's just a new one to me. There's no such thing as failure, only learning. And so next we're going to talk a little bit more about where we started with covering cropping, and where it went well and where it didn't go well, and we'll both talk a little on this. So this was so we have a cheatgrass pasture. And so our first goal when we started cover cropping was we're going to try to tweak and change the soil in the cheatgrass pasture. So this was the first time. We had an old drill at that time, and just put the seed in, and it did come up. It had great rows, and it was a combination. It was like a mix. We did a seed mix on it, and then so this one is there's the exclusion cage, and the rest of everything. Well, what happened was that the deer came in, and so we ended up putting these cages up so that we could see how like how it might have grown if there weren't just a batch of deer. They just came over the ridge that year, and I don't know what the rest of the feed situation was, but and I have to ask Steve on this. So was that was when we started putting the fungal? Yeah.
So this picture, there's a meter square here inside this exposure, and we sprayed high fungal compost extract there on this meter square. So you can see the difference between the left-hand side and the right-hand side. Hardly any cheatgrass in the exposure, lots of cheatgrass outside. And that stuff is like 4 feet tall. That's Circum Sudan on the inside there. Go ahead.
Okay,
Here's another shot of it.
yeah. But the deer did also take down some of it, but yeah, this probably was the first time we used the high fungal, right? Yeah, okay. All right, so you know, I'm sure we're just such Nicole Masters fans, and so for me, she just opened my eyes at a conference we were at, and she's such a great teacher. And so this is just her most recent book, which is, if you haven't read it, it's, in my opinion, it's a must read. Here's her 5 M's: mindset, management, microbes, minerals, and organic matter. And she's got such certain sayings, you know, how she just gets it down to just a few little things, and she explains more about that in her book. So we're fortunate through our SARE grant to be able to bring Nicole to our place. And so these next few slides kind of show the workshop we had. We had 2 days, and it was only because of the SARE grant that we could afford to have her come, because she's getting harder and harder to get, you know, to do workshops and those kinds of things. And so we just feel blessed that she came for a couple days. So the first day was primarily ranchers, a smaller group, and then the second day was like open to the public. So we did a soil pit and a couple of soil pits, and we looked at a lot of the stuff together. And this is the same patch that Steve was just talking about, and you know, took the folks out there. And so I'm not sure what was happening in here. Well, basically, one of her premises is you always, when you're walking around your place, you always have a shovel. And so this was a shovel full of dirt, and just kind of random, you know, and then she was doing it like an analysis of it. It's like, here's the scoop. It was so helpful to us to have her come, because you know, there's different pastures on her place and different things that you could learn from each one. So in general, you know, no one size fits all. Walk around with a shovel, learn the history of your piece of ground, observe what's going on both above and underground, and use simple tools to monitor what's happening under your feet. And that's so a couple of the simple tools that is in this photo. One of the people at the workshop is using a garlic press to squeeze the juice out of the grass. It's a bricks test. It tests the sugar. And just to the side, like when she was there, I don't know how many garlic presses we broke. Like, she had this fancy garlic press that was just made never to break for doing, you know, doing the bricks test. And somehow we managed to break that. And you know, it's harder than you think, like squeezing that little garlic press to get the sugar going. So this is another really simple test, because you can make everything yourself for the water infiltration, and you pound the little hoop in, and then what you do is you actually you pour a cup of water in there where that little ring is. It's only pounded in maybe an inch or two. Pour the water in, and it's a good test of the porosity in your soil. And this is a really cheap way to do it. You can make all these things yourself, but you know, if the optimal is that you want the water to just absorb. And maybe some of you have seen like the Gabe Brown comparisons of how his neighbor's field after a rainstorm, it's all just kind of sitting on the top, and then his field, everything, all the water that comes in, you know, gets absorbed. And so this is a way that you can look at your own soil and just see, well, what's my absorption like? And what we found on our place, it was different in different places. And then when you find that, you have to just do a little detective work and say, well, what's working? Why isn't it, you know, why is it so, you know, compacted here versus other places? And anyway, So this is these are some images of when we really got started on the high fungal compost. And so would you talk about the pit down there?
No, go ahead.
Oh, well, okay. Well, so we went down in the San Luis Valley. They have a huge, we first got acquainted. We tried some high fungal compost in a small way in our place, but then found that there was somebody in the San Luis Valley that was doing a grant, you know, or had gotten a huge high fungal compost pit going. And that's, we actually got our first batch of buckets of compost from, who was that?
Dave West.
Oh, okay. See, that's why it's like Dave West. And so this was our first mixing, and a guy named Patrick McGinnis, if you know him, he's from the San Luis Valley.
Oh, Patrick O'Neill.
Oh, Patrick O'Neill. And so Patrick McGinnis is one of my ex-students, and I'm sorry to remember him, but anyway, this is Patrick O'Neill. And it was a great guy. Forget Patrick McGinnis. So, so he came up with this huge, you know, like a mixer. Well, we put the buckets, I think I have a picture of it. So we'd load, oh, that's Annie. So we, you know, we just carried the compost over to this big mixer and rinser. And then what it was doing was removing the fungal from the, you know, from the soil. And then that was what we first spread, our very first fungal, you know, experiment kind of came from that batch of rinsing. So this is a more, this is Annie Overland and I think her daughter and her daughter's friend. But what we're doing now is just same compost that we're getting from the San Luis Valley, but have figured out a way to, you know, mix it ourselves, just with some tools we have around the place. And so, and then this compost we sprayed. And anyway, so this is just, Annie had a sprayer. And so this we just sprayed on just the top of the soil. And I did not take a picture. We have a new drill. And Dave West, again, he fitted the drill with a little drip system so that it goes right through the drill and then right into the soil, as opposed to spraying it on. So here's some resources we love, and of course, For the Love of Soil, Nicole, and then you know, Dirt to Soil, Gabe Brown, great book, and then Netflix, if you haven't seen Kiss the Ground. And then on YouTube, Gabe Brown did this really interesting presentation to Congress. And I was pretty impressed. Somehow he got it lined up so he could actually go talk to Congress about soil health, because it seems like sometimes that gets really missed in the conversation about you know, climate control. Is like, well, wait, this is really basic, you know. Sometimes you just in my opinion, it sometimes gets overlooked. Okay, so basics: minimize soil disturbances, minimize bare ground, the soil armor, keep a live root in the ground at all times, and integrate livestock. And we really believe not only about the soil disturbances, but adding the livestock is something that we feel is just really important for lots of reasons. And so just systems work together to create diversity in plants, animals, and our underground livestock. Believe in biology. And it's a journey, not a sprint. So if you're still at some other spot, you know, we feel like we're still trying to learn and get better. And it seems like every year we maybe get better at something and maybe take 2 steps backwards, but we're, you know, that's our goal anyways, to just keep going forward. So these are just some diversity pictures I put at the end just because I liked them. And just to laugh, if you haven't seen this, it says, if I could just figure out a way to charge on a pay-per-view basis. And so we often feel really grateful that we don't have to worry about that particular thing, but it's kind of a good ending. So I'm going to stop share. I don't know. I have no idea how long that took, but we'll see how it goes from here. Yeah.
That was perfect, Nancy. And we'll just, if anybody has any question, let's hold those until afterwards, and we'll jump right to MJ if you're ready. Thanks, Nancy. Thanks, Steve.
Oh, thank you.
All right. Let's see. All right. Loading still for everyone. There we go. My name's MJ. I'm with Calder Farm, and we're based in Gunnison, Colorado. These are just some photos, and I'll just pitch that we're the co-founders of the Colorado Regenerative Network, which is the Colorado Savory Hub. A little bit about us. We started in 2016, so we're just in our 8th season. We operate in Gunnison, which is averages around 8,000 feet. My husband and I are both first generation producers, and we mainly do pasture-raised pork and some mixed vegetables. We do operate on leased land only, so we don't own anything. And we sell direct to consumer and some wholesale markets as well. Well, maybe I'll mention a lot of our projects with our pigs they're all on irrigated pasture, and that with a few cottonwood galleries. And in our valley, we lease around 1,100 acres. So we're doing a lot of these projects across a lot of different properties. So we are really fortunate to have Western Colorado University here in our backyard, and a really cool master's program that allows us to work with a lot of different grad students. So this picture is from one of our grad student plots who was applying 2 inches of compost onto our pasture to look at our 2 main research questions were increasing water holding capacity, as well as looking at carbon sequestration potential, particularly in the carbon stock. It was a pretty interesting project. She worked with us as well as 3 other ranches. We were the only folks who had pigs on our property, but I will say we also followed our hogs typically follow a cattle herd from some of our friends. So it was really interesting to see this experiment. In the first year, it's 2019, and it was a really wet year for us up here. And during that year, we saw a pretty significant increase in grass height. And we also obviously saw a decrease in bare ground, right? That compost was creating that litter. In the drier years that followed, we did not see a significant increase in grass height, which was really interesting, but we did see a lot more clover pop up. And that's what this picture is just all of that clover starting to come up in between some of the other grasses. And there was a lot of the soil moisture probes they were using saw a higher soil moisture content, particularly after irrigation was shut off. So longer into the season, the soil was holding that water. What we did find with this particular experiment was it wasn't really scalable across all of our property, but was really useful in addressing some of our problem areas, our higher and drier higher and drier spots with more bare ground. Another project we're working with a grad student on is integrating biochar into our pastures. So if you're not familiar with biochar, it's basically charcoal from organic matter. This is all made on site. So it starts, you burn it, it's at a very particular temperature for a certain amount of time. And what we do is we break it up and integrate it into our compost. And then it sits for a little bit, and then we apply it in this last picture. So this one, it's a pretty new study. We just got it applied last fall, so we're just now seeing some of the effects. But again, we were looking at increasing water holding capacity. Yeah, but it's a really interesting process. It takes a lot of processing, and it's a little bit more of a complicated production for us on our farm, on our property. If we had someone who knew how to do this at a commercial scale, it might be more useful for us on our property, but it's pretty interesting to see, and I can keep you posted as we learn more. But like I said, we just applied this before snowfall last fall, so we're still learning a little bit about that. But our main practices that we really focus on is a lot of moving our hogs frequently. So our hogs, these are our hogs on the right. We follow our friends' cattle in the growing season as best we can. They move a little bit quicker than our hogs do, but we're usually just a few days behind them. But they're a different tool. They're a different beast from cattle. So we're using our hogs a little bit more for that animal impact. They're grazing much less. Hogs only consume about 25 to 30% of their diet is grass. So we do have to supplement. But it's been really, really cool to see these animals work some of the land and the incredible benefits they're providing. One of the coolest things we've seen is helping to eradicate Canada thistle from higher and drier ground, as well as some of our irrigated pasture. And that's because they're going after the roots, which is the main way Canada thistle grows and expands. Their seed rate is not very high, but it's pretty interesting. We've in 4 seasons grazing this particular area, we've nearly eradicated the Canada thistle. And there's just like, before we were on that property, it was about 5 foot tall thistle, and now we're just seeing like a few tiny little rosettes, which has been pretty cool to see. What else should I mention? I guess the other thing to mention with our hogs, particularly focusing on the soil, is how much they can impact it. So we do move them into cottonwood galleries pretty frequently. They help break down that woody material pretty well. And we use that a lot during sensitive times. So, yesterday we moved our hogs now that we're nearly at peak runoff and where we have a high water year. So we've moved them into that to let our pastures breathe and get some space from that impact. But our main tools really are frequently moving our animals and really knowing our land and being out there monitoring what's happening with the grass, with the bare ground, any impact that those animals are making. So I think that's kind of all I had. I'm happy to answer questions later.
Perfect. Thank you, MJ. All right, Mihail. You ready?
Yep. Let's see. Oh. All right. So, Mihail Kennedy, Bee Bar Ranch, Big Timber. I'm just going to cover our slaughter waste composting. We do a lot of regenerative practices with grazing and cover cropping, pasture stitching and stuff too. But the big unique thing we do is we compost all the slaughter waste from the local slaughter plant in Big Timber. Pioneer Meats kills 50 to 75 beef every week. And we take all of the slaughter waste to our ranch. As originally we were just going to take our own, but the rendering plant pulled out of Montana, and we just said, well, heck, we're there twice a week anyway, we might as well take all of it. So it's how we're closing the nutrient cycle. You know, the way we think about it is every pound of beef that leaves our ranch, because we sell organic grass finished beef, every pound of beef leaves the ranch is nutrients from the soil. So how do we close that nutrient cycle there? And we figured this was probably the best way to do it. We get paid to take it too, so it's a money-making prospect too. These are some of our cattle. Just kind of, this is the start. This is one of my apprentices from last year, Chelsea. So we process our, we bring all the beef back, we package it, we sell it direct to market. But what she's holding there is nutrients that have left the soil, and so I'm trying to claw all of that back. Trying to be a net increaser on that nutrients. And so then this is, after Chelsea's cooked it, it turns into this. But so what we do is we have partnered up with a local sawmill as well. We do have to pay them a little bit for the wood chips, but it's their waste wood chips. So we put a base of about 18 inches to 2 feet of wood chips down on the ground. In our compost site. We've just got a small, I think it's called a minor commercial compost site, and technical lingo in Montana. And so we bring back probably 30 to 45 cubic yards of slaughter waste every week, all year round. And so we put them down on this bed of wood chips. And I'll warn you, if you're squeamish, some of these pictures aren't the prettiest. It's taken us a while to get used to it. It's nothing now, but for a while there, it was pretty gross. So we haul the slaughter waste in a manure spreader. We just took the beaters off the back. So it kind of multi-purpose. Once we finish our compost, we can use it to spread too. The picture, let's see, the picture on the right is a full load. So that's about 15 yards. The picture on the left that was our first load ever of slaughter waste. We brought probably a half load. It was mostly, I think it was about half hogs and half cows. And we learned a lot. It took us a long time. Our originally we put straw bales or straw down, but found the straw would compact really bad and wouldn't breathe very well. So you couldn't get the flow. Airflow to, we want the air to flow from the bottom to the top, because we static compost these piles for about a month to 2 months before we even start turning them. And we found that with the straw, it'd compact really bad. We'd get some seepage, some leakage out of it. It'd smell really bad. The neighbors, I'd complain, it was near my house. We've since moved our compost site a little further away. But we also figured out with the wood chips, it gives it's high carbon. It gives enough structure that the pile can actually breathe without us turning it. Currently, I have some piles that have been sitting static, haven't turned them or watered them for about 6 months, and they're still running 130, 140 degrees. Still respiring, still aerobic, not anaerobic. But that, it was a steep learning curve on that one. It took us about 3 or 4 months to figure out that the straw was not the way to do it, and we had to get the wood chips. So this is just a picture, over here is where we'll add a little bit more wood chips, or at least back then this was early days on our figuring out what our recipe was. We'd add some more wood chips to the top. And then we'd cover it with either manure. We used to run a feedlot operation here back in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so we had about 20 years of manure that we'd piled up from the feedlot operation. And we went through that in about 8 months. Because it ate it up fast. So we ended up figuring out that for every 2 piles that we finish, we save 1 for covering the next piles coming up. So what that does is it just kind of jump starts that new pile. It's got all of the microbes, all the fungal. It's just essentially inoculating the pile so it can go and just start right up. The piles will, once we cover them for about a week, they'll actually grow as they, everything gases up inside all the rumens. They all swell. And so it'll grow from, the pile usually is about 6 foot tall when we finish covering it that day. And then it'll grow to about 8 foot tall over the next week. And then it'll drop down over the next week and a half, 2 weeks to about probably 4 foot tall after all the liquids have kind of settled into the wood chips. And it only takes about 5 days for it to get to about 120, 130 degrees. And the picture on the right is kind of that's what our partially digested compost looks like. It's our cover. It's a good filter for the odors that come out of that early stage. It's a little sickly sweet for about a week. And then after that, you don't smell it at all. We don't have any issues with vectors or the only issue we had was our neighbor's dog would get in every once in a while and take some bones back home. And about once a month, Frank would come back over with a wheelbarrow full for me, and I'd just throw them back in the pile and they'd break down. But we are composting everything: bones, skulls, hides, everything that isn't being used at the slaughter facility, the butcher plant. So this is some of the piles that are, when they're static composting. In the wintertime, you'll see some steam. The picture on the left, the 150 degrees, that's a pile that has not been turned. The one on the right, those windrows have been turned. It takes us about a month and a half of loads to finish a windrow. And I'll show you why we do the windrows in a little bit. But what we do is we wait until the last load or the last part of that pile that we built is about a month, maybe a month and a half old. 4 to 6 weeks usually we wait before we decide to turn it. That being said, our tractor broke and our water froze this winter, so we haven't done much turning this year. But with all the rain we've had and the way we've built our piles, they're still cooking just fine. We do have probably 1,500 cubic yards of finished compost that we're going to be spreading in the next couple of weeks, so that's pretty exciting. From start to finish, so this is a picture of us turning it. It shows, that's not dust, that's steam. We turn it in the wintertime. It could be 40 below, and those piles are still active. The outer 6-8 inches might freeze, but the inside still stays nice and warm. So it really is a year-round operation, as long as our water hasn't frozen up. In the wintertime, if we get a lot of snow, I'll just push the snow on, I'll plow the snow on top of the piles. It just percolates in, melts in. Anything to save a little bit of time and labor. But from start to finish, it takes about 6 months, 4 to 6 months. If we were really diligent and I had a little bit more labor and machinery didn't break down as often as it does, but that's machinery for you. It would take about 4 months to finish from start to finish. So this is our windrow turner, just to kind of give you the scale of it. That's my daughter and I there, and we've had some tours. The Montana Meat Processors Association has toured. A lot of regenerative ranching and farming groups have toured, because we are kind of pioneering this in Montana. I know there's a couple other places around the country doing it, but most meat processing plants currently are sending all their slaughter waste to a landfill and paying landfill tipping charges. We charge slightly less than the landfill, which still pays. It makes the project pay for itself. Never mind the end product, the value of the end product. But it covers labor, and the machinery is paid off within. Well, I take that back. Some of the machinery is paid off. If we had to buy all of the machinery, we actually got a COVID grant through the state of Montana for the windrow turner and water wagon in the second round of meat processing grants that came out during COVID. But this is the only way you can, I mean, we can do it in the way we're doing it, as large as we're doing. We need a way to aerate things properly. We tried turning with just our tractor payloader and it did not work. It doesn't aerate it enough, and getting the amount of water in there was impossible. So we kind of lucked out on this one, but you know, if someone wanted to start up a compost program, if they had a slaughter facility nearby, I mean, it's like $50,000 for the entirety of it. And we paid that off that first year we had everything. So and then you have all the we're at some point going to make compost teas. We have a tea brewer, make compost teas, apply them through our pivots, through our sprayer, spread the compost, potentially sell the compost at some point. I'm working on some genetic testing and biological testing to really tweak our compost to make a really high-end product that could value up to $30 or $40 a pound. So just that's mostly to kind of reinvest in the program and keep the machinery working. The majority of the goal of that program is to spread it on our land, our dryland pastures, rangeland pastures specifically, just to increase our water holding capacity, production, that kind of stuff. But it's 14 feet wide is our turner. We haul it behind the tractor. The drum is 1,000 RPM. It's really, really scary when those knuckle bones fly out. So you have to stand quite a ways away. The nice thing though is usually the first time through, the bones that haven't broken down in that first 2 months, they come to the outside, we scrape them up and we put them underneath the next load of fresh guts, and they're broken down the next time we come through. We have popped quite a few tractor tires though, before we figured out how to collect the bones properly. But we bought this old C50 tanker truck, and the picture on the left, it shows the water wagon. There's a pump on there that connects to our turner and injects water onto the spinning drum as we pass. And we can put down about 1,200 gallons in one pass before we have to refill. And so we've got a 1,500 gallon water tank, and we just usually, when we're really turning the piles, we'll have one person running the water tank down to the creek, pumping water out of the creek, fill it up. By the time the person turning the compost is done, we can just dump water straight into the turner and flip back around again. And we could do probably 20 passes in a day if all of our equipment's working well. So this is kind of a picture of, we stopped the turner mid-turn. You can see the white in there is microbial and fungal activity. There's a lot of it in there. The wood chips are breaking down. We realized that we probably put too much wood chips in the first round, but as far as I'm concerned, I don't really care if the wood chips go out on the land partially broken down. It's better than the bare ground, but it's going out with compost too. So, I've been working with compost for the last almost 20 years in various ways, and the perfect recipe, you're never going to achieve it. It's kind of, you hit the goals you want to hit, and then you just have to live with, I'm going to be throwing bones out there. There'll be wood chips that don't break down entirely, but as far as I'm concerned, the fertility I'm putting out there and the water holding capacity is going to be worth it. And this turner is really good at pulling the twine out too. Sometimes there's some twine from the cow eats some twine or something like that, and it comes out through the rumen and stuff. But this is probably the first time we turned, maybe the second time we turned the pile. So it really is, it breaks down really fast in the static compost, and then really it's just a matter of, it'll get to 120, 130 static composting. Unless we get some rain, it might go a little higher. But once I turn it like this and get it to the proper moisture content of about 45 to 50% moisture, it jumps up to 160, 170 and just sticks there for months, probably about a month and a half. If we weren't turning it, we turn it once a week at that rate, just or whenever it needs water. And once we, and you'll turn it and you'll see the temperature drop to about 130 and then back up again the next morning to 160, 170. When it stops raising in temperature after you turn it, we just let it sit after that and it cures. And that's kind of when you've got the finished compost. And it takes about 3 to 4 weeks to cure in this system, it seems like. This is a picture of turning it on a cold day in the winter. We did have all of our neighbors call us at one point saying, "Are you burning today?" Because that cloud went up probably 100 feet in the air. And you can see the bones laying around out there. We just, like I said, we scrape them up, we throw them in the bottom of the next pile, and you know the big bones don't make it through the pile twice. It'll be that first time around, and that's pretty much it. Here's another picture. This is these are some pretty close to finished windrows we had. And it was probably 30 below zero that day. And we just make sure we winterize our water wagon for the most part, but we had no problem turning all winter long, as long as the reason our water froze this year is we had 50 below for about 2 days straight here in December, and the creek froze solid pretty much. So we weren't able to pull water out of it at that point, and we just gave up on that for a while. Just another picture of some mostly finished compost. You can kind of see the darker color. From what we've seen, you know, the compost kind of steadily gets darker and darker and darker, and then when it goes through the curing process, it kind of gets lighter a little bit, and when it changes a couple shades of brown to a little bit lighter brown, and that's when you know it's done. And then this is a picture of where I just kind of spread some. When was that? This was not finished compost, so it was really interesting. We spread it and everything grew like crazy right there, but the cattle stayed away from it. I'm not sure if it was because there were still bones in it or not. But this year, this is the third year, and so this year, actually, the cattle hit that first thing when they got into that pasture. So it's showing that, you know, there is definitely better, you know, nutrient transfer and stuff in that grass, better growth, better production. And so, yeah, that's about it. Like I said, we do a lot of different things out here with our soil, and with regards to soil and regenerative, but this is kind of our unique one.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We do have a few questions here in the chat, and I'm just gonna go through from the top here. Nancy asked, MJ, I would like to hear more about your compost mix.
Was that for the compost experiment or the biochar that is integrated into the compost?
Well, I was fascinated when you were talking about that 4 inches of compost. And I think that was before you were talking about the biochar, and just kind of trying to, that was sort of mind boggling. That is a lot of compost, the 4 inches, and then you got a great result, result. So I guess just your basic, because I just was trying to process that.
Yeah, it was, if I said 4, I meant 2 inches.
Oh, okay. Well,
yeah.
That's still a lot.
Yeah, it's still a lot. And that was mainly for experimental design. And what we found is we're actually in practice spreading much thinner. But that was actually, we were using, it's called Gunny Gold. It's a biosolid waste from the city, which we don't use anymore, but that's what we used in that experiment. It was donated to the student. But yeah, we are actually very interested in looking at higher fungal count compost as opposed to the higher bacteria compost for probably a lot of the same reasons you all have switched to it. I think our soils in the West need more fungus and less bacteria, which is what we're trying to switch to. But our biochar compost mix, we call ourselves lazy composters. We don't turn a lot. We're not very scientific about what goes in and, you know, ratios. We just like to experiment and play. And if it looks good to us, we use it. So
you don't have any indication of how the biochar might boost the whole thing, or are you still working with that?
yeah, so the research behind the biochar is to focus on soil fertility. And we're using the biochar in more sensitive areas that we don't like to have the pigs in. And so the thought behind the biochar, or using compost to activate the biochar, is to increase soil fertility and water holding capacity. There's a lot of questions on if it will eventually help to sequester more carbon, but we personally believe that carbon is just a little tunnel vision for a lot of these questions we're asking.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then we have a few questions from Jeremy. The first one is for Steve and Nancy. Are Steve and Nancy doing any composting of the wood chips from tree clearing? I have many large piles of ramial wood chips from the electric co-op and doing Johnson Sioux beam compost with it, but would like to know others are composting tree waste.
Go for it. I mean, I don't. Yeah, I mean, I have.
Yeah, we did use some chips from our wood lot in compost. And that is an ongoing experiment. Just got the pile going last fall, so we'll see what happens.
And we don't have a large supply of trees. You know, when with our pinion patch, we're just really careful just to do little pieces at a time, and not you know, just wipe them all out. We wanted to sort of you know, be planned on what we took and what we didn't take. So the source is probably not as big a source as some might be. The power line trees, for instance.
Thank you. Feel free to interrupt, Jeremy, if you have any follow-up questions. But here's the next one. Have you tried, and this is for Mihail, have you tried using lactobacillus serum to help prevent bad smell from the slaughter waste compost?
No, we haven't. We're also lazy composters. The only thing I'm experimenting with to prevent the smell. And honestly, the bad smell lasts for about a week. When it's composting, it smells like compost, it smells like earth. We are adding bone char. We do make bone char with a retort. So we turn probably 5% of the bones we bring back into bone char. You know, it's calcium phosphate, so calcium and phosphorus really limiting out here in the West. So we're adding that to our compost, and it does change a little bit. It does pull some of those volatiles back out and bind them onto the bone char. But we haven't done a whole lot of amendments other than that, because it is kind of another byproduct that we are working with.
Thanks. And then there's another question, Mihail, do you have to worry about dewormer, antibiotics, or chemical residues used in raising animals?
We haven't. We've been testing and haven't found any residues yet. So I mean, I've seen a lot of research lately on prion diseases too, and how, you know, like BSE and chronic wasting are, you know, it takes 1,000 degrees almost to break them down thermally. But the composting process, some chemical or physical process going on there breaks them down, no problem. So as what we found, as long as we can keep those piles above 130 degrees for I think 15 days is kind of the minimum for our regulatory minimum. Everything we've tested has not had any antibiotic or chemical residues in it.
Perfect, thank you. And then there's a question if Nancy and Steve and also you, Mihail, would be willing to talk about the cost effectiveness of spreading compost on rangeland. Have you found that the application effectiveness is linear or does it plateau as you do repeated applications?
Well, what I found was, because we've done compost teas, we did it for about 5 years straight, testing every year on our pivots, our irrigated ground. And what we did was we did our initial testing with Earth Fort on biological to see if what our balance was on microbial to fungal, and it was microbial, obviously, a lot heavier microbial. After about 3 years of more fungal compost teas, we got it down to about 1-to-1, maybe 2-to-1, and stopped doing our compost teas, and our management, changed our management with that for better grazing our pivots and our irrigated pastures. And we've been testing every year since, and it hasn't changed. The only thing that has changed is the ratio of fungal to microbial has not changed, but the amount of active and total fungal and microbial populations have increased quite a bit, as well as our nutrient cycling. So I don't know where the high end of that is, but we're probably, I think last year, even in the drought we had last year, they estimated we were turning over we're fixing 400 pounds per acre of nitrogen, just biologically. So we'll see what this year's results show. But this year's probably going to be different because we already have twice as much moisture as we've had in, well, let's see, we already passed last year's total moisture and then twice what 2021 was. So this might not be a good year to really get some good data on that. But I have seen our carrying capacity quadruple with how we're grazing those pivots, and production's gone way up with it over the last 5-6 years. So I haven't seen the end of it yet. The dryland, though, is such a slower thing out here. So the areas I have applied to dryland, we've seen more diversity, I guess, in native plants coming back with the better biology, I think. But the last 2 years we had grasshoppers like crazy and drought, so it's still kind of hard to tell on those ones. The irrigated pastures where you have control over the moisture, definitely it just keeps going up.
So our short answer is, so far we haven't gotten out into the rangeland so much. I would love to, because I've seen some really great things, short videos and things about, spraying. Just even one guy who just took a sprayer and he just sprayed his rangeland with, high fungal. And so Steve might have more of an answer, but anyway, right now we're just really trying to focus on our cover cropping and to see if we can improve that. But I have a follow-up question from Mihail, which is, so when you determine the nitrogen content, then what tests do you use to when you're trying to do follow-up testing?
We use the Earth Fort total biological as well as the Haney test. The Haney is the big one.
Yeah.
If I'm doing a big spend, every 3 years I do the full biological, but I do the Haney every year.
Yeah.
Because it's only like $35 or something like that. And then
Yeah.
when we do our dryland, the only places I really do it is where I have been doing my cover cropping and pasture stitching, because we no-till into range pastures just to add diversity. And I normally wait until the plants have come up and at least hit second leaf stage, and then I use it as a foliar feed.
Yeah, thank you. So we started out with the Haney, and then now we're doing like some more tissue samples. But one sort of side story is that after Patrick O'Neill, we had to clean out the rest of his barrel after he was all done. And so, well, where are we going to put this? We put it on the garden, and holy cow, the different things we've gotten in the garden now. Like
Yeah.
if you talk about, you know, like stuff I'd never had in the garden before, and the garden wasn't bad soil, but it really did make some changes in some of the plants that came up. So,
Yeah.
but anyway, so hearing that from you is similar to what happened in our garden.
And if you think about it in those range situations, you know, there's a huge seed bank out there and they're just waiting for the right conditions. And you change the conditions out there and all of a sudden things show up.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I had a question for MJ. I found pigs really challenging on pasture out in the West, but I also didn't have them on irrigated ground. And so I'm noticing like folks that are really successful tend to use them on irrigated ground. But I'm wondering, so we always have some bare patches after pigs because, you know, they'll eat some grass, but they'll root around, they'll hang around the feeder, they'll sleep in one spot. Do you guys put seed down after you've rotated them out, or how do you remediate those little bare patches?
No, we don't. We we move them pretty frequently in the growing season where they're going to be doing the most damage in their wallows, where they're nesting, that sort of thing. We also make sure we're leaving quite a bit of grass so that when they are nesting, they're not rooting around to make their nest. They're pulling the dead, you know, last year's grass to make that nest. And yeah, moving them every 2 to 3 days seems to keep that pretty minimal. And it doesn't allow for over impacting that ground.
Yeah, and what breeds are you raising? Have you chosen certain breeds for that reason? Or I've had certain breeds where I'm like, holy smokes, I would never put these on pasture. Like digging out.
Our main herd is typically a Mangalitsa Hereford cross, and we've been playing with buying in some spotted and red Wadlers, but we prefer the Mangalitsa. They have that long hair, which in Gunnison is really necessary. It sounds like we get similar temperatures to you, Mihail, within pretty regularly -40, -30 degrees. But that cross is really really important for us. We used to do straight Mangalitsa and we used to do straight large blacks, and that they just grew so much slower. So that hybrid vigor is really important for us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's kind of funny that the hogs, we used to bring out all these shelters for them, especially for the winter, and they never used them. They were always, you know, we would go check on them and it's -20 something and they're outside of it and they're steaming. So yeah, they're an interesting tool.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
While we're talking about pigs, MJ, I was trying to picture in my head what the Canada thistle situation looks like. So if you put the pigs on a pasture, I mean, is that the first thing they go for because they're super excited about it, or do they just make a whole mess everywhere else too, or
No, they're pretty selective. They love it especially if you get it in the spring. It's really juicy. It's typically one of the first things to come up. And so they go right after those roots, and we see pretty minimal bare ground after that. If there's some grass, you know, there was already a little bit of grass coming through. But yeah, they pretty select that. They love that. That's like candy to them. So they're going after that first.
And do they just chew off the roots and leave the rest of the plant behind, or?
Yeah, they prefer the roots. They will eat the rest of the plant. But if we're moving them fast enough, they'll go after the roots, leave the tops.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Very cool. Thank you.
Yeah, it's really cool.
We have another question in the chat here from Lauren. I believe Mihail mentioned genetic testing and compost. Could you talk a little about that?
Yeah, I don't have any data back yet. We're working with Eva
Stricker.
Stricker, yep. Sorry. At the Carbon Ranch Initiative, Kavira, she's doing some genetic testing to see who's in our piles. Some of them, family wide anyway, they're, we do have some idea of what potentially they are doing in the pile. Perhaps they're methanophiles or whatever, certain breakdown processes, because there's various life, you think about how quickly the life or how fast the life of a bacterium is. It's just like dung beetles, there's different stages of decomposition. There's different dung beetles for different stages of that cow pie. And so we're trying to figure out who's in our piles, what potentially they are doing, maybe what we're missing, if we could inoculate with a certain strain of something. I don't want to add anything until I know what's in there in the first place. More than likely it's mostly the native assemblage from around here, because we haven't inoculated with anything. But we're also testing prior to application of the compost, our native ranges. We're testing with University of Montana. Ilva Leckberg is the gal who's doing that, but she's testing the native assemblage to see who's in our soils first, and then how they react to and who shows up after we apply. So we took, I don't know, man, we probably spent a day and a half, 2 days taking, digging soil samples, sifting the soil, and she's testing that currently for the control as well, the control strips, as well as where we're going to apply. We want to know what was there first too. So I think we'll test the compost as well before we'll sample the compost before we apply it, send it to her for testing as well, just to see what, or who I should say, is going out on the soil there. And then we'll kind of see what, just what happens, who shows up, who, maybe this compost, adding this, all this organic matter is going to boost some of the native assemblages. In talking to Eva, she said that from some of her research, when you apply the compost, even if it's from somewhere else, you have a lot of specialists that show up in the compost and perform certain functions until they're no longer needed. They're likely still dormant in the soil. So if something happens and you have a good year and all of a sudden you've got a lot more forage, a lot more laid down on the ground, and there's those specialists can kind of just start back up again when they're needed. But for the most part, there's kind of a normal assemblage going on. But just figuring out who they are, what they're doing is the main thing we're looking for. And the nice thing is all that's free, because it's kind of cutting edge stuff. So everyone's interested in doing it for free.
Yeah, I actually noticed that's a thread between all three of you guys. You were working with so MJ's working with grad students, Nancy and Steve were working with Annie and Extension and some SARE money, and then, Mihail working with all these different, CRI and different organizations. I don't know if anyone wants to speak to that and some sort of successes and maybe setbacks.
We're also working with Montana State Plant Pathology Lab on a fusarium wilt for Canada thistle that is showing real promise. It attacks 3 different pathways, I guess, and it's species specific. We introduced it last year on the ranch. I think we introduced 32 different strains, and we've narrowed it down to 5 this year. So it's really it wilted it, and then some of it still went to seed on irrigated pastures, but none of the seed was viable. And so we're trying to take those strains, combine them, and figure out one that'll just take it out, because being organic, we don't have a lot of being organic, but also I'm vehemently against treating symptoms of problems, which weeds are. So I really enjoy having thistle around. My cattle eat it, and it serves a purpose in the soil. But the researchers are very much narrow-minded on that we need to kill it. And I get it, because organic farmers need some control that I don't need because I'm not a farmer. So we've had a lot of successes. I don't know that I could say we've had any failures, but maybe that's just because of how I look at things. We've learned from all of our mistakes, so I don't count them as failures.
We're also working with some folks at CSU looking at rust fungus on Canada thistle, but we haven't had any luck with it inoculating at our climate. So that's been interesting. But just over the hill in Paonia area, Delta, they're having a lot more luck with it. Yeah, but we really enjoy working with grad students and the university here. They're really focused on answering questions that the producers have and not necessarily what they're, proving their hypothesis. So that's been really fun to work with them and co-create a lot of these experiments to really address some of the issues that we're actually facing and not just hypothetical issues that they're interested in. So that's been really, really great, particularly with the local university here. I can't say that is what every interaction with researchers has been.
I don't think we have much to add to that. Working with Annie and the SARE grant were huge. We've also had a lot of help from just the NRCS. Like when we first started out, like the amount of help they gave us on our cross fencing when we were off, when it was the cattle, we were totally thinking, well, this is what we're going to do. And we have done it. How many pastures? Tell the pasture numbers. Like we started with 0 and then ended up with, I don't know how many smaller pastures we have on this place, but yeah, so a combination of things, and we'll see where it goes.
Maybe I'll also just mention it's really useful for our management to have someone else who's focusing on collecting data or, because I think in our day-to-day, it could easily get lost. So having that like secondary person to be like, oh yeah, we have to go collect this, or oh, we're gonna go, spread biochar today. It just is really useful in keeping that at the forefront, especially with things that are new and we're testing out and we don't know if they're gonna work or not. So I think that's been a really big benefit for us.
Yeah, and we've actually hired a company to do our monitoring for us because that's the first thing you drop when the season gets busy. And it's the most important thing you can be doing, despite the fact that the day of, it doesn't feel like it. Cattle are on the road, but you should probably just let them be and go do your monitoring. And that has really helped us because it's taken the onus off of us to do that. We still get the data. It doesn't cost a whole heck of a lot. We're also kind of we're putting together a conservation easement on the ranch tied to ecosystem function, which is a very difficult thing to measure. So right now we're in the first 3 years of baseline data collection and figuring out how to actually legally set that up. And that was, we have to have really good data. So at that point, you just have to say someone else has to do it. And it really took a load off of me not having to do any monitoring.
Any other questions from anybody?
I have a question. This is Lizbeth, and I guess I have a question for Mihail. So I live in Taos County in New Mexico, and I know our county is interested in getting some slaughter waste composting going because there's a mobile matanza unit, like a mobile slaughter unit, that should become available pretty soon to use. And I'm just curious what scale you feel like is the minimum for getting something like this going. Like, is there a critical mass of material that's important to the process?
I think it all depends on now. I'd say even if we were doing half of what we're doing, if we were doing 15 cubic yards a week, that's 50. That's a lot. Yeah, there is. I'd say if you were doing like 500 cubic yards a year, it might be worth investing in some machinery, some larger investment. But for the most part, I've seen a lot of people doing a lot of good things with static composting of mortalities. Especially with slaughter waste, they compost way better than mortalities do. So really, a skid steer and wood chips and a something to cover manure or something like that to cover it would be more than enough. And a lot of times manure is something that ranchers are trying to get rid of. If there's any feedlots nearby, that's a no-brainer right there. You don't need to go as big as we do with all the equipment. Sometimes I wish we hadn't. When the transmission on the tractor goes out, that's when I'm like, maybe we should limit what we're doing. But I don't think, I think you can get away with quite a bit still with minimal investment on that. But I think it really is a really good direction to go. A lot of the processors in Montana have been coming out and are probably 4 to 6 months out from having their own compost sites. So I think by the end of the year, almost every slaughter facility in Montana is going to be composting their own waste, or at least a neighbor ranch or farmer is going to be taking it for them.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Anybody else want to ask any last questions? All right, well, I'll wrap it up then. Thank you guys so much. Thanks to Nancy and Steve, MJ and Mihail. I really enjoyed you guys' presentations. Thanks for bringing pictures. That was really fun. Thanks for everyone taking the time this evening, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. And nice job, Luca.
Thanks. Have a good night.
Bye, guys.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Enjoyed it.
Thank you, Nancy.